I sit in the parking lot of the Atlanta Marriott, watching valets shuttle luxury cars past the fountain entrance, and I cannot make myself open the door. My brother's rehearsal dinner is already underway inside. My phone shows 6 missed calls from my mother and 1 text from my brother that just says, "Please come in." I have been sitting here for 22 minutes. The laminated badge from last month's Forbes Healthcare Innovation Summit is still clipped to my laptop bag on the passenger seat. I never take it off the bag. Not because I'm proud of it, though I am, because some small, stubborn part of me hoped that one day my father would see it without me having to say a word. I take a breath. I think about the conversation at the kitchen table when I was 14, the one I have replayed so many times the edges have worn smooth. I think about what my father said that night, how certain he sounded, how final. Then, I think about what I have built since. $28 million in Series B funding. 43 employees. A partnership with 3 of the top hospital systems in the country. A platform that my father's own colleagues use every single day without knowing his daughter built it. I pick up my badge, drop it back in the bag, and go inside. Before I tell you what happened at that dinner, I should tell you where I started. Growing up in Buckhead, the wealthy northern corridor of Atlanta, meant a certain kind of pressure that arrived in the form of country club memberships and college counselors hired in 8th grade. Our house was a craftsman colonial on a quiet street lined with oak trees, and it always smelled like antiseptic and achievement. My father, Robert Matheson, was the kind of thoracic surgeon whose name appeared on hospital wings. He had trained at Johns Hopkins, published over 60 peer-reviewed papers, and treated his dinner table like a grand rounds lecture. My mother, Diana, had been an architecture student when they met. She won a regional design competition in her 2nd year of graduate school. By the time I was born, she had quietly traded her drafting table for a calendar full of my father's faculty obligations. My brother Ethan was 2 years older than me, built like my father, smiled like my father, and from the time he was 8 years old, announced that he intended to be a surgeon like my father. He meant it sincerely. What I did not understand then, and would not understand for another 20 years, was how much that declaration cost him. I was not a bad student, I was a complicated one. I had a talent for pattern recognition that made certain things effortless and other things baffling. Biology made no sense to me. Memorizing anatomical structures felt like trying to hold water in my hands. But I could look at a system, any system, a school cafeteria line, a traffic pattern, the way our neighborhood pharmacy ran out of certain medications every winter, and immediately see where it was broken and what would fix it. My 3rd grade teacher wrote on my report card that I had an unusually analytical mind. My father read it and asked why my spelling scores were below average. The first real wound came in 6th grade. I had spent 3 weeks building a project for the school science fair. Not the kind of project with a foam board and a volcano. I had mapped every reported flu case in our zip code over 4 years, cross-referenced it with school attendance data I requested from the district office, and identified a pattern showing the school's ventilation schedule was accelerating transmission. I proposed a modified schedule and showed projected reduction in cases. My science teacher, Mrs. Tran, pulled me aside before the fair and told me it was one of the most original projects she had seen from a student at any grade level. I placed 3rd. 1st and 2nd went to projects about plant growth and magnet polarity. My father drove me home in silence. When we pulled into the driveway, he finally spoke. He said that creativity without scientific rigor was just guessing dressed up nicely. He said that Ethan's project on cardiac valve models had won 1st place 2 years before because it demonstrated real discipline. Then he went inside to take a call from the hospital. My mother found me in my room an hour later. She sat on the edge of my bed and did not say much. She just held my hand. Then she pointed at my project board, which I had propped against the wall intending to throw it away, and said quietly that she thought it was brilliant. I believed her. But a mother's opinion, at 12 years old, does not carry the same weight as a father's silence. The pattern repeated through middle school and into high school. Ethan earned straight A's in biology and chemistry, ran the pre-med club, shadowed my father at the hospital on weekends. He came home with the glow of someone being confirmed in their calling, and my father would spend entire Sunday evenings walking him through cardiac anatomy at the kitchen table, a warmth in his voice I heard nowhere else. I discovered technology my freshman year, not because anyone guided me there, but because I found a broken process and needed tools to fix it. Our school's appointment system for college counseling was a paper-based disaster. Students missed appointments. Counselors double-booked. I spent 4 weekends building a simple scheduling platform on a free website builder and presented it to the counseling office. Within a month, every counselor in the building was using it. The assistant principal wrote a letter to my parents complimenting my initiative. My father read the letter at dinner, set it down, and said, "It is a nice hobby." He then turned to Ethan and asked how the MCAT prep course was going. I kept building things. I entered a regional tech competition junior year with a prototype I called ClearPath, a tool that helped patients understand their discharge instructions using plain language and visual guides. Medical jargon confused people. People got readmitted to hospitals because they did not understand what they were supposed to do when they went home. I had seen it firsthand, sitting in the waiting room enough times while my father operated. I read the literature. The problem was enormous and almost entirely unaddressed. I placed second at the regional competition. The judges' written feedback said the concept had genuine commercial potential. I made the mistake of telling my father at dinner that night. He listened. He set down his fork. He said, "Claire, medicine is a discipline that takes decades to understand. You cannot solve its problems with an app built on a school laptop." He said that real contributions to healthcare came from people who had done the work, the science, the clinical training, the years of study. He said he worried I was confusing enthusiasm for capability. He said, "And this is the part I will never unhear. Your brother will save lives in that operating room. What you're describing is a product someone makes to sell to hospitals. Those are not the same thing." I excused myself from the table. I went upstairs. I did not cry. I was too angry to cry. That anger became the most useful thing I have ever owned. College application season confirmed what I had suspected for years. Ethan had been accepted early decision to Emory, pre-med, and my father celebrated with a dinner reservation at the nicest restaurant in Buckhead. When my acceptance letter came from Georgia Tech's College of Computing, my father said congratulations in the same tone he used to acknowledge the weather. The week before I left for school, my mother came into my room while I was packing. She closed the door behind her. She opened her purse and handed me an envelope. Inside was $8,000 in cashier's checks, every dollar of which I later learned came from a personal savings account my father did not know about, money she had set aside from a small inheritance her own mother had left her. She pressed the envelope into my hands and held them for a moment. She said, "You are going to build something real. I have known it since that flu project in 6th grade. Don't let anyone talk you out of it." Then she wiped her eyes, straightened up, and went back downstairs before my father noticed she had been gone. I left for Atlanta's tech corridor with her $8,000, my own $1,200 in savings, and more clarity than I had felt in years. For the first time in my life, no one at Georgia Tech knew I was supposed to be the one who didn't quite measure up. No one compared me to my brother. No one graded my work against a rubric built around someone else. My roommate was a computer science junior named Priya who became my closest friend within 2 weeks. She was the daughter of 2 engineers and had approximately 0 patience for self-doubt. When I told her about my father's assessment of my tech ambitions during one late night in our dorm, she looked at me over her laptop screen and said, "Okay, but has he seen your GitHub?" She had not yet seen my GitHub, but she said it with enough certainty that I laughed, and laughing about it was the first time it felt smaller. I worked part-time at a campus IT help desk and freelanced on weekends building websites for small businesses. Every dollar went back into ClearPath. I rebuilt it 3 times from scratch over my first 2 years, each iteration sharper than the last. By junior year, I had a version that had been piloted in a free clinic off campus, and the clinic's patient satisfaction scores had improved by 31%. I published the pilot data in an undergraduate research journal. Professor Sandra Okafor, who taught health informatics and had spent 15 years in hospital administration before academia, read the paper and emailed me. She asked me to come to her office. She said, "I want to understand how a 20-year-old saw this problem more clearly than a room full of people with graduate degrees." Then she offered to become my academic advisor. Professor Okafor introduced me to the world of health tech venture capital in a way that was impossible to access from outside. She knew which investors took early-stage healthcare platforms seriously and which ones would waste my time. She taught me how to pitch, how to structure a cap table, how to protect my equity. More than the tactical knowledge, she showed me how to be a young woman in a room full of men who had already decided what she was, and how to walk out of that room with what she came for. "They will underestimate you every single time," she told me one afternoon bluntly. "Stop waiting for them to stop. Use it." I graduated with a 3.9 gigapascals. My personal portfolio at that point was worth $70,000, money I had made freelancing, investing cautiously in tech stocks throughout college, and the prize money from 3 competitions. ClearPath had its first 2 paying clients, both small regional clinics. My father attended graduation. He shook my hand, told me I looked well, and spent the lunch afterward asking Ethan about his first year of medical school. I moved to a studio apartment in Midtown Atlanta, so small the kitchen and living room were the same room. I worked from my kitchen table for 14 months. I ate a lot of rice and beans. I called Professor Okafor every week. I pitched ClearPath to 41 investors over 9 months before a firm in Austin offered me a seed round of $600,000. I was 24 years old. I did not tell my parents. At this point, you might ask why. The honest answer is that I had learned by then exactly what happened when I shared good news with my father. Not cruelty, exactly. Something more deflating than cruelty. A pause, a reframing, a suggestion that whatever I had accomplished existed in a category slightly below what actually mattered. I was not willing to watch him do that to this. So I kept it private, the way you keep a fire small until it's strong enough not to be extinguished by one cold comment. The next 4 years were brutal in the way that building something real is brutal. I hired my first 2 employees from Georgia Tech. I slept 5 hours a night for the better part of 2 years. I went through a round of almost funding that collapsed 3 days before close, and I sat in Professor Okafor's living room unable to speak for 30 minutes while she waited me out and then said, "Okay, who's next on the list?" The breakthrough came when a hospital network in Tennessee agreed to a 6-month pilot of ClearPath across 4 facilities. Their readmission rates for patients on the platform dropped by 19% in the first quarter. Their compliance department began recommending it. The network's chief operating officer, a woman named Margaret Holloway who had been in healthcare administration for 30 years, called me after the first month's data came in. She said, "I have seen 100 platforms promise this. Yours is the first one that actually changed how patients behave." "How did you know what to build?" I told her about the waiting room, about watching patients leave with discharge papers they folded into their jacket pockets without reading, about the flu project in 6th grade. She laughed. She said that was the best origin story she had ever heard. Then she introduced me to her network. Margaret became the second woman who changed the direction of my life. She made calls on my behalf that opened doors I did not know existed. She joined my advisory board. She understood both sides of the problem in a way that pure tech investors never quite did, the clinical reality and the system-level incentives, and she pushed me to think bigger than I was allowing myself to think. Series A came at $2.5 million. Series B, 2 years later, at $28 million. By the time I turned 31, ClearPath was operating in 63 hospital systems across 19 states. My father's own colleagues used it to generate patient summaries. My net worth had crossed $8 million. I had 37 Forbes coverage pieces totaling more media than I had ever anticipated. None of my family knew any of it. I drove an economy car when I visited for holidays. I dressed simply. When my father asked how work was going, I said it was going well, and before I could say more, he would turn to Ethan to ask about a case. The habit was so established that I had stopped trying to interrupt it. At 31, I started reconsidering the silence. Not because I needed my father's validation. That need had quieted slowly over years until it was something I could observe without being controlled by it. But because the weight of carrying a double life had grown exhausting. Because I was tired of sitting at a family dinner pretending to be someone smaller than I was. Then Ethan announced his engagement to a woman named Rachel, a pediatric oncologist he had met during residency, and our mother began planning the rehearsal dinner. Standing now in the Marriott's lobby, I can hear the room from the corridor. My father's laugh, the clink of glasses. I smooth my blazer, which is designer and which I did not bother to downgrade for tonight. I walk in. My mother sees me first. She crosses the room immediately and hugs me with the kind of force that says she was worried I would not come. She looks at my blazer. Then she looks at my face. She does not say anything, but she squeezes my hand and I understand that she knows something is different tonight. Ethan wraps his arms around me and tells me I look great. Rachel shakes my hand warmly and says she has heard so much about me. I wonder, briefly, what version of me she has heard about. My father gives me a one-armed embrace and tells me I made it, his voice carrying the mild surprise of someone who had considered the possibility I would not. Dinner is a round of tables set with white linens and small candles, about 60 guests, mostly family friends, hospital colleagues, and Rachel's family from Chicago. I am seated between an aunt and a man I do not know who turns out to be the chief executive officer of a regional health network, introduced to me simply as Daniel, Rachel's uncle by marriage. We talk through the first course about nothing in particular. Then he asks what I do. I have answered this question 1,000 times. I have a version for investors, a version for journalists, a version for polite cocktail parties. Tonight, I am tired of the smaller versions. I say, I founded a health tech company called ClearPath. We build patient communication and navigation tools for hospital systems. He goes very still. ClearPath, he repeats. Yes. He turns to look at me directly. We rolled out your platform across our network in March. Our readmission numbers are the lowest they have been in 11 years. He stares at me for a moment. You're that Claire Matheson? The table around us has gone quiet in the way that happens when someone's voice shifts register. Sigh. He stands up slightly from his chair, turning toward the head table where my father sits with Rachel's parents. Tom, he calls out, and my father looks up. Did you know your daughter is the founder of ClearPath? We just implemented it across our entire network. It is genuinely transformative work. The silence that falls over the table is total. My father's expression moves through several things quickly. Confusion first, then the beginning of the same instinct to redirect or minimize, and then something stops it. Maybe Daniel's tone, maybe the word transformative, maybe the 60 people who are now looking at him. Audrey works in, my father begins and then stops, because he has used the wrong name. My name is Claire. He has called me by the wrong name. No one points it out. The error hangs in the air. Daniel is already pulling up something on his phone. He turns the screen to show the table my photo from the Forbes Healthcare Innovation Summit feature, the one where I am standing at a podium in front of 300 hospital executives. We had her speak at our leadership conference last spring. I did not realize, he says, looking at my father with genuine surprise. You must be very proud. My father says nothing for a moment. Then he says, of course. Dinner continues, but nothing is the same. I can feel my father's eyes on me across the room. Rachel catches my gaze and gives me a small, unreadable smile. My mother is very still beside my father, her hands folded in her lap, her expression the careful, neutral I have watched her wear my entire life. After the main course, my father appears at my elbow and asks if we can speak privately. We step into an alcove near the corridor. He stands with his hands in his jacket pockets, and for the first time in my adult life, he looks uncertain. He says, "Why didn't you tell us?" I have rehearsed versions of this answer for years, but the rehearsed versions were angrier than what I feel tonight, which is mostly just tired. I say, because the last time I told you about something I built, you explained to me that it wasn't a real contribution to anything. He starts to say he never said that. I tell him exactly what he said. The words, the dinner, the fork he set down first. I have them memorized. He is quiet for a long moment. I tell him that I stopped sharing because I needed to protect what I was building from the version of me he had already decided I was. That by the time it was big enough that his opinion couldn't diminish it, the habit of silence had become easier to carry than the alternative. He says, $8 million. I say, that's what Daniel told you. It's actually more than that. He exhales. He looks at the floor. He says, I'm sorry, Claire. He uses my actual name. I don't know that I knew I was doing it. I tell him that's the part that cost us the most time. Not cruelty, unawareness. We go back to the table. Ethan finds me during the cake cutting and pulls me to a corner of the room with the urgency of someone who has been waiting all night for this moment. He looks shaken in a way I have not seen from him before. He says, "I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago." I wait. He says he is leaving the surgical track, that he has been accepted to a fellowship in architectural medicine, a hybrid field working with hospital design teams on patient environment and flow, the physical infrastructure of healthcare. He says he has been miserable in the operating room for 3 years and has been too terrified to tell our father. He says watching what just happened tonight, watching me stand there and tell the truth about what I built without apology, made him feel, for the first time, like he could do the same. He says, "I've been jealous of you since college. You got to be yourself." I look at my brother, who has our father's face and our mother's eyes, who has been performing a role since he was 8 years old, and I feel the architecture of my childhood rearrange itself into something that makes a different kind of sense. I say, "You were never the golden child. You were the cautionary tale about what happens when someone loves you the wrong way." He laughs, and it is the kind of laugh that lives right next to tears. Later, when most of the guests have said their goodbyes, I find my mother sitting at a table near the window with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. I sit down beside her. She looks at me for a long time. She says, "I watched you hold your ground tonight and I felt two things at the same time, proud in a way I don't have words for, and ashamed of how long I stayed quiet." I tell her I need to say something I should have said years ago. I tell her about the envelope, about what her $8,000 meant not just practically but in every decision I made when I was afraid, about the number of times I was in a room pitching to people who were ready to dismiss me, and I thought of her handing me that envelope with both hands, and the thought steadied me. I take out my phone. I pull up a transfer confirmation I prepared 2 weeks ago and set the phone on the table in front of her. It is the full amount of her savings, with interest calculated from the day she gave it to me, plus a number that is larger than the original sum by a significant margin. It is not a grand gesture. It is just what was owed. She looks at the screen for a long moment. Then she puts her hand over her mouth. I say, "You believed in me before I believed in myself." That's worth more than I can actually transfer, but this is the part I can. She cries. She holds my hands and cries. And then she says something I did not expect. She says she has been looking at small commercial spaces near our neighborhood, that a studio is available on a street she has always loved, that she wants to return to architecture in the only way that makes sense to her now, designing small residential spaces, working with clients she chooses, answering to no one's schedule but her own. I tell her I will cover the first year's lease. I tell her it is not a gift, it is a correction. A week after the rehearsal dinner, Ethan tells our father about the fellowship. The conversation, by Ethan's account, is difficult and long and ends without resolution. My father calls me that evening. It is the first time he has called me without my mother also on the line in at least 6 years. He says he is trying to understand what happened. He says that he thought the path he laid out for both of us was the kindest thing he could offer. He says the word kindness with a genuine belief that stops my anger before it can form completely. He is not performing remorse. He is genuinely confused about the distance between his intentions and what we experienced. I tell him intentions are only the beginning of the story. I tell him the rest of the story is what the other person felt. He says he wants to do better. He asks if I would be willing to talk more. I say yes, with conditions. The conditions are simple. He asks questions before drawing conclusions. He corrects himself when he gets my name wrong, because he has called me Audrey twice, and I am not going to let it become a habit. He does not introduce me as his daughter who works in tech. He says the name of my company. He agrees to all of it. I do not know yet whether agreement is enough, but a door that was sealed for 31 years is now open by several inches, and that is more than I expected to walk away with. My mother signs the lease on the studio 6 weeks later. She sends me a photo of an empty white room with good north-facing light and a drafting table she found secondhand and refinished herself. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, is a small framed print I recognize. It is from the design competition she won in her second year of graduate school 30 years ago. She has kept it all this time. I look at that photo for a long time. I think about the flu project in 6th grade, the participation ribbon, the drive home in silence. I think about the nights I worked alone in my studio apartment, eating rice and beans, certain that the thing I was building was real even when no one else could see it yet. I think about Professor Okafor saying, "Use it," and Margaret Holloway saying, "How did you know what to build?" And Priya saying, "Has he seen your GitHub?" with that absolute confidence that cost her nothing and gave me everything. I think about Daniel saying transformative, and 60 people at a rehearsal dinner going quiet. The labels other people attach to you have a shelf life. They expire the moment you stop agreeing with them. My father called me the one who wasn't quite bright enough when I was 14, and I carried that word like a stone in my pocket for years until the stone was simply too heavy, and I set it down and kept walking. The walking was the whole thing. The walking was all of it. I have a standing call with my father every other Sunday now. We are careful with each other in the way of two people learning a new language. Some calls are stilted, some are better. Last month he told me, without being prompted, about a hospital administrator who mentioned ClearPath at a faculty event. His voice when he told me had something in it I was not prepared for. He said, "I told her my daughter built it." He said it like someone who had just discovered he was allowed to say it. I do not know what our family becomes from here. I know that Ethan is designing the first space of his fellowship project, a pediatric ward with natural light at every room angle. I know that my mother has a client now, a young couple who wants a renovation that respects the original structure of their home while making it genuinely livable. I know that I hired a director of clinical partnerships this month so that I can stop working on Sundays. I know that sitting in that parking lot outside the Marriott, I made a choice that I had been postponing for almost a decade. Not to explode the family, not to finally win some argument that had been running since 6th grade. To stop making myself invisible for the sake of other people's comfort with who they had decided I was. Tonight, if you are watching this from a house where someone is holding a smaller version of you in their head like a fact, I want to tell you something directly. Their version is not the final version. It is a draft. Drafts can be replaced. The question is what you decide to build instead. If this story landed somewhere real for you, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me about someone who underestimated you and what you did with it. Hit like if you stayed through to the end. And subscribe because the next story is one I have been wanting to tell for a long time. I will see you there.